This is the second of two epilogues that exist within the book of Judges that really do correspond to the two prologues to the book of Judges. Last week we looked at the religious disorder that was taking place among all of the people, not just among the leaders, the judges, the deliverers, but also among just really all the people. Well, today we shift and we're not looking so much at the religious disorder, but the moral disorder, really just the blatant immorality of the folks. So there are, if you did not read the material, there are some disturbing things that we have to at least address at some level this morning. But the good thing is that we will come back next week and we'll be in the book of Ruth. And all things will be nice and good and wholesome from that point forward. So anyway, we're glad that you're here this morning. The Lord be with you. And also with you. And let us pray. God, one of the reasons that we turn to Scripture is to find ready answers for the problems that we face. But the relentless refrain of the book of Judges keeps hammering that we are the problem. We admit we've lived our lives thinking freedom's the endless opportunity to do as we see fit. But this book tells us that that's the very definition of bondage. We are more than just a little bewildered, God. Is there really more to salvation than a safety net meant only to break our falls? Is it really the offer of a mutual relationship that can mature and blossom and ultimately transform us? We're tired of comforting assurances that accomplish nothing. We long for something more. We long for a relationship with you. Amen. Well, all right. I think there's no way to deal with these chapters other than to just jump in. So we'll jump into chapter 19. Did you all read the material? Any of you read the material for today? It's pretty nasty stuff. So it opens up with the reminder. We keep getting this reminder as we're working through these final chapters, and here it is again. In those days there was no king among the people. I brought up last week that that's more than just some kind of a throwaway line that, oh yeah, we're before Saul and David and Solomon. This is really a statement that gets to the heart of the fact that the Hebrew people, soon to be known as Israel, that it's more of a theocracy. Even behind the king that looks like all the other nations around them, there is another king that rules even the kings. It is God who is the primary king of the people of Israel. So when the text is telling us there was no king in Israel, it's not giving us a throwaway line, this is pre-Saul. It's saying folks are paying no attention at all to God. They have forgotten God. And remember, that forgetting line means that they are no longer heeding that which God says. They're just ignoring God. They're doing the other way that this line is, instead of saying in those days there was no king in Israel, is they did as they saw fit. They did that which was right in their own eyes. Not that which was right in God's eyes, but that which was right in their eyes. So it's a stark, confronting kind of statement that opens up these last three chapters that we're going to look at. And you know, at some point, I know there will be those who want to argue differently, but finally the church very strongly says that people are not inherently moral. It's just, sorry, that's not true. You may feel differently, but that's what folks in Israel are thinking, and so we're going to see where that ultimately leads in these chapters. People cannot ultimately be good apart from God. They may not be rankly nasty, but you just really can't be good apart from God. And those of us who have got a little bit of age on us and remember the death of God's 60s, surely we don't have to have much to convince us that you can't have a whole lot of morality apart from God. All right, so this opens up in chapter 19 talking about another Levite. We saw a Levite last week, and if you weren't here last week or don't remember what we talked about last week, there was a Levite who is all about, he's full of ambition, and he wants that which he can't get back home, wherever his Levitical city is, and he's moved around. He's actually come out of Bethlehem, which is really weird and strange because Bethlehem is not a Levitical city, but that's where he says he's from, which just can't be. But that is where he was last before he shows up in the story, and he's seeking a better place, a better position. And a gentleman who has stolen all of his mother's wealth and is then cursed by her and then realizes, maybe I ought to give it back to her, and ends up creating idols, household gods, and all kinds of stuff, and hires his own priest, makes his own son a priest. When this Levite shows up, he goes, aha, I think I can do better than my own son. I will hire this guy to be my personal, private Levite to do all these worshipful things. And so the Levite decides, yeah, I'm happy to get paid to do this work. This is pretty good. Well, I don't need to go any further on all of that, but that Levite, at the tail end of chapter 18, the very last lines in chapter 18, it finally divulges who this character was. And if you weren't here last week, or if you don't remember that line, suddenly it tells you that his name was Jonathan. And you go, that's really helpful. So what? Well, there's two Jonathans in the Old Testament. One is the son of Saul, King Saul, but that's still to come. This is another Jonathan, and it tells you that his father's name was Gershom. And that's about as helpful as learning that his name is Jonathan. But then it tells you his grandfather's name. His grandfather was Moses. This is the grandson of Moses, the great lawgiver. And in 2 generations, the decline of righteousness from the great lawgiver who is considered the friend of God, the declination has become so terrible that this is a guy who will stop at nothing to get what he desires. Leave that to now talk about another Levite. It could be Jonathan. Another story about him. But there's nothing that says that, so we're just going to, given what happens in the story today, I'm going to assume this is a different Levite. It is not Jonathan. Incidentally, when 18 finishes, I mentioned last week that this notion that Moses' grandson could be so terrible was so embarrassing, so shaming to the Hebrew people that they actually began inserting another letter into that name. In English transliteration, they began inserting a little letter N so that it's no longer the grandson of Moses, but it's the grandson of Manasseh, so that they didn't have to deal with the fact that it was Moses. We don't have that opportunity to get away with stuff this morning. So, all right, the Levite. He has connections, just like the last one, to the hillside, the hill country of Ephraim. I used this picture last week. We don't know just where in the hill country of Ephraim is, but this is north of Jerusalem, still contemporary Jerusalem today, somewhere kind of in the vicinity of where Bethel is, north of Jerusalem, but just to be any more exact than that, we can't get there. This Levite is married. He has a concubine for a wife. We don't have a clue what a concubine is. I mean, we say we do, but it's not a prostitute, but neither is it a full-fledged spouse, a full-fledged wife. It's like a wife, but not a full wife. And that's about all that you can really say regarding a concubine. She could live with her husband, or she could not live with her husband. She could be the same race. She could be Jewish, or she could not be Jewish. In this particular instance, she's from Bethlehem, the area of Judah, upper northern Judah, just beneath Benjamin. And her husband, this Levite, is from somewhere in the area of Ephraim. They get married. She isn't too thrilled about her Levite husband, and so she leaves and goes back home. After 4 months, he decides, I kind of like being married, and I'm tired of her being gone, and so he treks down from wherever he lives in Ephraim down to Bethlehem to try to get her to come home. Here at the end of the book of Judges, there are all kinds of allusions back to previous stories. That little allusion should, if you were here for the Samson portion, you remember Samson. He didn't exactly have a wife. He had a woman who looked right in his eyes that he wanted mom and dad to get for him. So he goes down. I don't need to go through the story, but it's an allusion back to some of these things. These chapters are full of them. I won't mention them all, but that's a good one just to realize. The Levite, after 4 months, goes to his wife's, his concubine's home. She introduces him to her father. The father says, "Good to meet you. Stay here with us for a while." So instead of just going down, getting his concubine wife and going home, he ends up staying a day. He stays 2 days. He stays 3 days. By this point in time, he's ready to leave. So they get up on day 4 to head home, and the father-in-law says, "Oh, no. Stay another day. Let's eat and drink and be happy for 1 more day." The Levite says, okay, that's fine. Day 5 comes around. He gets up, ready to leave, and father-in-law says, no, stay here and eat, drink, and be happy with me. So he stays through the first meal of the day, somewhere around lunch, we might say, and then gets up to go, and the father-in-law says again, no, stay a 5th night. And the Levite says, no, I'm done. We're going home. Mistake number 1. It's already up into the afternoon. They didn't have daylight saving time, but it still gets dark over there, and so he's leaving sometime in the early afternoon. He's heading north from Bethlehem to get up into Ephraim, wherever his home is, which is never designated. He also has a servant, and he has 2 donkeys with him. So they get to Jebus, which is the name of the town before it becomes, as we know it, Jerusalem, which means that it is populated by Jebusites, not by Hebrews. That is important to keep in mind here. They're arriving at Jebus right about the time it's starting to pale to get dark. It's becoming evening. The servant says to the Levite, I think we should just stay here for the night and then finish our trip tomorrow. The Levite says, oh, no. We can't stay with foreigners. We've got to get on to a Hebrew town. We're not staying here. We shall continue on, and we will get either to Gibeah or to Ramah, towns further on north. The next town along the way is Gibeah. It is a Hebrew town in lower southern Ephraim. They get to Gibeah. It is now night. It's all the further they can get. But the Levite says that's perfectly fine. We'll stay here now for the night because it is a Hebrew town. So they come into where the well is in town, and they wait for somebody to invite them to their home to spend the night. An inn, you might think, but it's just going to be somebody's home. Well, they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and nobody says, come on home with us. Finally, one gets the idea that it's probably getting quite dark by this point. an older Ephraimite man who's been out in the fields working sees them and says, "What are you doing here?" And the Levite explains, "Well, I'm just trying to get back to my home in upper western," he doesn't say western, but upper western Ephraim, but nobody's invited us home. I've got food, so I don't need to eat your food. My donkey's got fodder. I can feed my own donkeys. We just need a place to spend the night." And the older man says, "Well, come on with us then. That's perfectly fine." There's the old man. This is actually, believe it or not, a scene that is painted by all of the great European masters. If you can find one picture of this, you can find 50 pictures of this. He says, "Come on home with me. You can spend the night with me." So they do. They feed the donkey. He begins to offer them food. And about the time they are really getting into their evening meal, the men of the town, the Gibeaites, the rowdy Gibeaites, show up and pound on the door. And the older Ephraimite man opens the door to see what's going on, and they immediately demand that he send out the Levite. They want to gang rape him. Shades of Sodom and Gomorrah from Genesis 19. And if we know the Sodom and Gomorrah story, it's issues of just incredible immorality that God is not willing to put up with, and so the towns end up being destroyed. The problem here, not that that was not a problem, but the problem here is that these are Hebrews acting like Sodom and Gomorrah. And before we really even get into these chapters, we're confronted with the blatant fact that the Hebrew people themselves have become as immoral as Sodom and Gomorrah. And it gives us the entry into these final chapters as to how we need to understand them. The older Ephraimite man says, no, and this is following the Sodom and Gomorrah story. That's terrible. You shouldn't even think such thing. I'm not going to send him out. They demand insistently that he do so. The old man says, "Look, I have a daughter. He has a concubine. We'll send those out to you," as if that's any better, but we'll send those out to you, but not the Levite. And the men say, "That's not who we want. We want the Levite." And so, since they're not getting anywhere with all of this, the Levite grabs his concubine, throws her out the door, and slams the door behind her. And one gets the impression that the Levite goes back and has a nice dinner with the older Ephraimite man. The townfolk, the rowdy men of Gibeah, will then spend the rest of the night gang raping this woman, this concubine. Toward morning, they will finally release her. She stumbles back to the Ephraimite's home, falls down on the threshold of the home, and that's where, in the morning, the Levite hasn't gone out to see where she is or to rescue her at any point. There's no indication that he has given a second thought to her. In the morning, he's getting ready now to load up his donkeys to get on his way. He opens up the door, and there's his concubine wife laying on the threshold. And his words to her, does anybody remember what they are? "Get up!" She doesn't respond. So he just picks her up and tosses her like baggage across his donkey. It's unclear if she's dead or almost dead. The story just leaves it at that. He takes her home. By this point, she is dead. And what next we learn, there's she is on the doorstep. And there's a whole bunch of these pictures among classical artists as well. He's put her on his donkey. He gets her home. She's dead. And so he begins chopping her into pieces to send one piece to each of the 12 tribes of the Hebrew people. And this chapter ends with the statement that the Hebrew people are angry. There never has been such a thing among us before. But it doesn't tell you what such a thing is. Is it almost the Sodom and Gomorrah-ish gang raping of a Hebrew? Is it rather the death of the concubine? Or is it the cutting up and distribution of the woman? It could be any of those three. It could be all three. We have gone from a man running after his concubine to bring her home, to the gang raping of her, tossing her out into the night and being gang raped, to now being killed, to even being chopped up, mutilated and chopped up and distributed to each of the other tribes. Not good. The Hebrew talks about the chopping up of the limbs. Not that this matters at all, really, but it's about the chopping up of limbs. So it's very likely that it would have been a hand, a forearm, and an arm. Ankle, lower leg, leg, as opposed to heads and so on. Not that that matters. So the Levite has distributed his concubine throughout the Hebrew people. And the Israelites, the Hebrew people, are just absolutely livid regarding what has taken place. They respond with a lot of anger to receiving a body part from this Levite. And so they assemble for war, not very far away from Gibeah, just a little bit west of there. And we're told that all of the tribes come to decide what it is that they need to do in light of this heinous act that has taken place. But having told us that all of the Hebrews show up in order to do this, then there is a parenthetical statement. Really, everybody showed up except for the Benjaminites. They don't show up. We're not really told all the details on that, but they don't come on the front end. They asked then, after having some long discussions, they asked the Levite, tell us what took place. And so the Levite, now front and center, begins to explain what took place this particular night. And like we sometimes do, when we find ourselves in a position like this, we are less than fully honest regarding what it is that we say. We sometimes will tend to put ourselves in the best light that we can. And this particular Levite does precisely that. Instead of being truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth statements, he begins to explain how those Gibeahite men wanted to kill him. Well, there's nothing in the previous chapter that says that. It's bad enough that they wanted to gang rape him, but there's nothing in terms of a statement that says that they wanted to murder him. He also leaves out, rather conveniently, the fact that the way that the Gibeahite men got a hold of his concubine was that he opened up the door and pushed her out. He doesn't say that. He just says, this is what the Gibeahite men did to my concubine. Having heard this report from the Levite and taking him at face value, all of the Hebrew tribes, not including Benjaminites, decide that they will now take matters into their own hands. They will judge and condemn and execute the Gibeahites for what they have done. And when they realize that there are no Benjaminites among them, they decide that what they were going to do to the Gibeahites, they will just simply do to the entire tribe of Benjamin. They will destroy the entire tribe for taking part in this type of thing. And so midway through chapter 20, they're in the midst of making their war plans. 1 out of every 10 is going to get supplies, but the rest of them will go ahead and do battle against the Benjaminites. This is the first time in the entire book of Judges, the first time, the only time in the entire book, where the Hebrew tribes unite together for a single action. They're doing what we thought they were going to do at one level way back at the beginning of the book in light of all those wonderful things in the book of Joshua, where now they were going to come together and claim the entire country for their own, etc., etc. It never happened. But here, after all of this, they're all coming together, but not to try to claim their country from the Canaanites or the Jebusites or Hivites or Perizzites or all the other ites that are out there. They're ganging up against one of their own tribes to do them in. We're on the front end of terrible internecine warfare. They finally come together, but for a terrible reason. And so they do attack. Most of the rest of the chapter is addressing the battles that take place between all of the Hebrew tribes and the Benjaminites. We're told there are 400,000 Hebrew swordsmen who have come together to destroy the tribe of Benjamin. As an aside, when they came out of Egypt at the time of the Exodus, there were 600,000 Hebrew soldiers. So in the space of 2-3 generations, as this moral and religious decline has been taking place among the Hebrew people, they have lost 1/3 of their population. They've gone from 600,000 down to 400,000. The Benjaminites realize what's getting ready to happen and realize they do have to defend themselves, and so they are able to manage to bring together 26,000 soldiers, 26,000 swordsmen, as well as 700 left-handed slingshotters. We've talked about these left-handed soldiers back when we were looking at Ehud, another one of those looking back moments here in these final chapters. These guys are the Green Beret elites among the Hebrew soldiers. They have bound their right arms long enough to be able to learn how to do left-handedly everything they could with the right, which makes them fully ambidextrous and twice as lethal because they can do with both arms. And even if not with both arms, they can do with the left arm what everybody else is doing with their right. And if you think, well, okay, whatever, it adds a statement that says these men are so deadly with their slings that they can hit without missing a hair. Pluck a hair, they could hit it with a sling. That's pretty lethal. So if you're looking very carefully at the numbers, again, this doesn't ultimately matter a whole lot, but if you're looking at the numbers, one place it will say there are 26,000 soldiers, another place will say there's 26,100. There's another place that will say 25,000, another place will say 25,100. There are a lot of soldiers. There are a lot of swordsmen. But then, however many there ultimately were, there were these 700 elite left-handed Green Berets that they could call up to help them. There are 3 battles that are described in chapter 20. All of the Hebrew tribes, with their 400,000 men, they're now ready to attack, and they do. And Judah leads the whole army in. They spend one day attacking, and they accomplish so much that at the end of the day, there are no Benjaminites killed, but there are 26,000 or 24,000 Judahites, as well as other Hebrew soldiers that are killed. It could not have gone more badly for the Hebrew soldiers. So they stop fighting at the end of the day and bemoan among themselves, what did we do wrong? Why did this not work? They go back for day 2. This time, however, just before they start the battle, they ask for one of the local priests to check and to throw the Urim and Thummim to decide whether they should or should not continue this battle. And the word comes back, yeah, go ahead. Sure, it's okay. So they go in a second time. Battle 2 takes place, and it is every bit as bad as battle 1. They don't lose quite as many people. They only lose 16 or 18,000 this time. 2 days of battle. Benjamin has lost none. The other Hebrew tribes have now lost 40,000. They've lost a tenth of their army. They're beside themselves at this point, wondering how could this possibly be taking place. So they stop the battle at the end of day 2. The 360,000 soldiers that are left marched 7 miles further north up to Bethel so they can offer burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to God as a way of appeasing God. They're not repenting of anything. They're just trying to appease God magically to get God on their side once again so that they can go back into battle a third day. So they ask a third time, God, should we be doing this? And the word comes back, yeah, whatever. This time you'll be successful. And so they go back down a third day, and this time, just before they start the battle, they decide, you know what? When we were having trouble, you remember what we did when we pulled off that ambush after, early on during the time of Joshua? Let's try that again. And so they decide to do a 2-pronged pincer movement kind of ambush. And what do you know? It works. They tease the Gibeonites out from the city. They start chasing the soldiers and thinking that, ooh, this is going to work again a third time, when the rest of the soldiers sneak in behind them, lay waste to the town, and then the Benjaminite soldiers are caught between them, and they decimate the Benjaminite soldiers. All but 600 Benjaminite soldiers are killed. The tribe is wiped out. The men are wiped out. The soldiers will then kill off all of the rest of the women and children and go through the rest of the Benjaminite towns doing precisely the same thing. The 600 Benjaminite men that don't get killed, they run off to a secluded place called the Rock of Rimmon, and there they will hide out. And that's where this chapter ends. So we not only have the sex of chapter 19, now we've got the violence of chapter 20. Moral disorder, the immorality is just rampant. It's become so bad that they're not only willing, but they're able and actually do accomplish the destruction of an entire tribe. No sooner do they destroy the tribe of Benjamin then they start questioning themselves, why did we do this? And they start asking questions of God, except it's really not questions that they are asking of God. They're not willing to take responsibility for what it is they've just done. They start accusing God they accuse God of killing off the tribe of Benjamin. They're the ones who did it, but now they're accusing God of engaging in this action. And so they begin to weep for the loss of their brother, Benjamin. God makes no response whatsoever to the accusations that they are throwing around. Although on the side, I suspect that if God had made any kind of a response to the Hebrew tribes, he would have said, you know, you've got it all wrong. It's Israel that has ceased to exist. You're acting just like the Canaanites. You're no longer Hebrews. You've become yourselves foreigners, which is something that we were told several chapters back. They had ceased to, the Hebrew words here, they had ceased to be an a people, and they had become a goy, a nation. They had become non-Hebrews. And now we see it fully, even though what I've just said about God making that response, that's not actually there, but it's just sort of between the lines. So once again, they offer burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, not as any kind of penitent act to God, but rather to try to get back on God's sides as a kind of magical action. But there's no response, again, whatsoever from God. So, unable to figure out what to do about the loss of this brother tribe, God being unresponsive to them, not responding to their offerings of any sort, they decide they're going to have to take, once again, actions among them. So they've got to figure out what to do. And apparently, sorry about this, Leon, there was a lawyer or two among them who said, well, I know what to do right here. And then it gives you a little bit of background. They had taken an oath way back there when the 400,000 of them came together. They had taken an oath in which they said that they would not allow any of their daughters to be taken by any Benjaminites. They would not allow a daughter to marry into that tribe. So if there were any Benjaminite survivors, and in fact there were 600 of them, there was not a Hebrew tribe that was going to allow a female to marry into that tribe. They were going to guarantee that there would not be any survivors ultimately. Another rash vow, like Jephthah had made previous. But now the lawyers get involved and say, you know what? You remember we took a second oath at the same time we took that first oath about not allowing any of our daughters to become Benjaminites. This second oath that we had taken was this. If there were any Hebrew tribes or any parts of Hebrew tribes that did not join the large army that went to battle against the Benjaminites, that we would destroy them the same way that we did Benjaminites. And suddenly they said, that vow trumps the first vow. They then realized that there was a small clan over in the land of Reuben, on the other side of the Jordan River, that did not send any soldiers to join the 400,000. So here's their plan. Here's how they solve an enigma that they couldn't previously solve. They decide that they would take 12,000 of their army, 1,000 for each tribe. They would march these 12,000 soldiers over to the little clan over in the land of Reuben, and they would destroy that entire clan, except that they would allow any females to remain alive, at least any virgin females to remain alive. That way, they could just take those women and give them to the Benjaminites. Does it make any sense? No. Is it ruthless? Yes. But when they got the legal stuff going in where they figured they could map it out for themselves, they decided this was a way to, they're not giving their own. This little clan had ceased to be their own, didn't join them in battle, so they're giving somebody else's daughters to the Benjaminites. They go over and they destroy the group. They're able to round up 400 women, and they go to the 600 Benjaminite men that are holed up at the rock of Rimmon and say, here, You can come home now. And they do. But there weren't enough women. There were only 400 and there were 600 men. So they haven't completely solved their problem. So the lawyers get together a second time to figure out what else they can do. And at this point, almost beside themselves, unable to figure out what to do, one of them remembers, oh yeah, there's a Woodstock festival getting ready to happen next week. And under the cover of all the goofiness that happens in that festival, surely we can steal a few women, kidnap a few women. And sure enough, when all the folks come together for this festival of the Lord, i.e. Hebrew Woodstock, because it's right they're in the midst of wine country and all that goes with that. So nobody knows what's happening. They decide this is it. They tell the Benjaminite men, look, as far as we are concerned, it is perfectly okay for you in the midst of this festival to just find you a woman that you want, kidnap her, take her hostage, don't ask for permission from anybody. Us lawyers will take care of that. We'll deal with any fathers that realize that their daughter's not coming home, and you'll have a wife, and you can survive. And that is precisely what they do. They steal another 200 women. Nothing good about it, nothing right about it, but it's a legal loophole that they have insisted makes it all okay. And the narrator is as stunned then at the end of the book of Judges as you are sitting there looking back at me. And so the final word in the book of Judges is, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Deal with it. End of discussion. There's where you end up if you do not heed God. If you choose to go your own way, there's where you end up. If you're looking for anything positive to be able to pull out then of these final chapters in the book of Judges, well, let me wait for them. Can you pull out anything positive on those?
Don't be a woman.
Don't be a woman. Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of hope if you're a male, but that's about it.
Not much.
Not much more. Yeah, there were only 600 out of the 26,000 that survived, but one of you, I don't remember which, a couple of you have asked the last couple of weeks, what are we supposed to take from this book? Stephen was one of them, I remember for sure. Why are we even reading? Why is this even in the Bible? And that's kind of behind some of the prayers these last 2 weeks. I think that we sort of, by default, think that the Bible's supposed to be smiles and assurance, and lifting, and make us feel good. And yeah, that happens. There's nothing in the book of Judges. There's no stories in the book of Judges other than possibly Othniel, way back at the beginning, to which you could point and say, there's a man, there's an individual that I can model my life after. He was a good person. They don't exist in the book of Judges. This is just this, morally, religiously, which forces us to have to look elsewhere for what the heck this book is about. And it begins, I think, if you stick with it long enough, it forces us to have to say, the Bible isn't about those people. The Bible isn't about us. The Bible is about God. The Bible is telling us the story of God. And even among a people as nasty and disgusting as his own people have become, they are, for all intents and purposes, by the end of, they are Sodom and Gomorrah all over again. But God's not going to destroy them again like that. God's not going to destroy anybody again like that. This book is about God. What is it telling us about this God who will stick with us even when we are like that? Even when we look for the legal loopholes. When we just completely ignore God and want nothing to do with God and think it's perfectly okay for us to do whatever is right in our own eyes, which doesn't exactly define any of us, but to some degree it does. In some degree it has. And we live among a people, not that they are necessarily church folk, that are like that surely. Here's God willing to be with these folk all through all of that. And it begins to open up our eyes to something about this God whom we're connected to. Not because of anything we've done or could do, but simply because of the covenant that God has made and refuses to break with us. That then is really the eye-opening thing about Joshua/Judges that we can then begin to apply to the rest of Scripture. The rest of Scripture, too, is ultimately the story of this God who has come to us, who does not expect us to get it sorted out, to fix ourselves, to clean ourselves up so that we can come to God. It is all about this God who has come to us in the midst of our dank nastiness and given us some options. It's pretty amazing, and it's pretty cool, and it really is where it needs to be. And that's what the whole New Testament doesn't tell us anything differently. It just puts a Jesus face on it. And it tells us the same story again. All right, I've given you some time to think about something good you can get out of the book of Judges. Have you got it yet? This is the best I can do. They have, by the end of the book, even though it is by means that you and I would say absolutely do not justify the end. I mean, the end doesn't justify the means. The means certainly don't justify the end. But by the end of the book of Judges, Benjamin has been saved. It's never going to amount to much because it was down to nothing. But it comes back a little bit. Guess what tribe first king of the Hebrews was part of? Even if you don't know, you can guess at this point. Benjamin. King Saul is a Benjaminite. And you're sitting there going, yeah, but he was a pretty crooked dude, and I don't care much for King Saul. That doesn't help me any. Okay, fine. Here's your New Testament version of the same thing. Guess what New Testament character was a Benjaminite?
Don't tell us it was the other Saul.
Paul. The Apostle Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Thank goodness Benjamin got saved. I'm serious. We wouldn't have our faith today if it weren't for that incredibly loquacious, but certainly incredibly theologically intense, perceptive, insightful Paul. Put it all together and was able to help us grasp how we as non-Jews get grafted in to this Jewish tree. We don't have our church today if it's not for Paul. He's so central to all that is for the church today. Yeah.
Well, and that makes me think that given the scholar that Paul was, he would have been quite aware of the whole history, the whole bloody history
Yeah.
of his own people.
Yeah.
So he would have been, you know, he was a prime choice to the person for whom Christ appeared and said, okay, whole new ballgame here. Let's make complete sense of this.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. Yeah, it's, one could run with this for a very long time.
Yeah.
I know a lot of folks don't like Paul for a lot of reasons. And we tend, insofar as we politicize some of these things, we tend to think Paul was a rabidly conservative creature that we want to get around. He was as left-wing liberal in his day as beyond anything that anybody was comfortable with. He helped revolutionize this little subunit within the Jewish faith. You know, there's all those other groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, you name them all. There was one more among that whole group, followers of Jesus, that little Christian group, just like all those others. And out of that whole first century mess, there are two groups that live on the other side of the first century. It's Pharisees who become rabbis who create Judaism. And it's the Christians, it's the other group. And here we are today. But that aspect of it is due to a Benjaminite successor by the name of Paul. Okay, take a deep breath, because when we come back next week, we can see that you know what? It was doom and gloom, but there were aspects, all of this is grace, really, through Joshua and Judges, but there were some real clear moments of grace in the midst of all that too. Because when we jump into the book of Ruth, the very first thing we're told is, during the time of the judges, there was a woman. So, breathe. If you haven't been reading it, read Ruth 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we'll come back next week to see the other side of the time of the judges. And if that doesn't convince you fully that that's okay, then here's the other reason that we've included the book of Ruth in this study. If that were not part of this study, then this entire study would have been ruthless. See you next week.